Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, think of everything that's been done in this country that affects business over the last, say, 2 decades. Tax, regulation, industrial policy, changes of government, more changes of government. Here's a bet. Brexit is more significant for companies in this country than everything else that's been done in the last 2 decades combined. Why? Because it potentially affects every interaction between government and companies. Tax, perhaps less, but trade massively. So it is no wonder that companies face it with their eyes wide shut. They know it's important, they're trying to gaze into the future, but at the moment it's hard to see anything as enormous uncertainty reigns. So today we'll be talking through the specifics of Brexit, how you cope with the inspecifics of it that we live with at the moment. Let's meet my 3 guests, all who have thought about this very hard. And first of all, Karen Briggs, who has a job, head of Brexit at KPMG, the huge international accounting and consulting firm. Karen, what is your role?
I lead our Brexit response team, which we set up post the vote to really help our own organisation and our own staff to understand what the issues were, because we're a UK and a global organisation, but also for us to help our clients.
And which sectors are the ones who've come to you?
Financial services has obviously been a big one, so banking, insurance and fund management, but also automotive, aviation.
Basically big sectors for the UK. Where were you on the day, the 24th, the day after the referendum?
I was at home in Cambridge, about to go on holiday to Europe.
So you took a holiday just as the action got going?
Yes, indeed.
And just to be clear, your background is accountant by background?
I'm an accountant by background, right. And I've specialised in regulation and financial services.
All right, my second guest is Gerald Mason. Now, Gerald's a senior vice president at a company you have probably heard of because you bought their big white bags of sugar, Tate and Lyle Sugars. And Gerald, your company was unusual in the business community in enthusiastically advocating that we leave the EU.
Absolutely, Evan. You know, European regulations on sugar cause awful trouble for our business in the UK. We've got a very large sugar refinery down in East London, near to City Airport. We employ about 850 people. And the key thing for us is that we manufacture sugar there from cane, which comes in from outside the EU. And in the rest of Europe, in 19 of Europe's member states, they manufacture sugar from beet. So when the rules are made, it's the 19 beet sugar countries that win.
And what was the specific thing that caused you to have problems relative to the beet competitors?
So when we bring in sugar from outside the EU, Europe limits where we can buy that from, and on some of the sugar charges us tariffs, taxes. And in contrast, the beet sugar producers in Europe in many countries get cash subsidies to grow sugar.
The equivalents of Tate and Lyle don't get subsidised, but they're raw material.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's a very unusual market. The end product is exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
But they're made in completely different factories and from completely different raw materials.
OK. My third guest, Gavin Williams, a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. It's an international law firm with headquarters in London and Sydney. Gavin, your role there?
I'm a partner in our corporate M&A business, but I'm also currently responsible for our coverage of Brexit.
Right, so you're Karen's head of Brexit equivalent, but in a law firm.
We slightly over-prepared for Brexit. We came up a little short on the Scottish referendum and slightly overcompensated, and so that meant that about 18 months out, we'd started to do quite a lot of detailed work. Most people were thinking, what are they doing? It's never going to happen, or it won't matter. And so for the first 12 months or so, it was a very lonely occupation. And it was only really as the polls tightened and the date neared that people began to turn their minds to it. And even then, frankly, it was a relatively small constituency of clients that were doing any serious work. So financial services are the ones that really did the detailed analysis before the vote. And now a great many more people are turning their minds to it, but there are still 1 or 2 burying their heads in the sand.
Right. Let me just ask this. I mean, in a way, it's a case study in business trying to plan for uncertainty and cope with a fairly big regime change, a shock, if you like, without quite knowing where it's all going to end. Is this unique? Can you think of other things in your careers or in business life which have been similar?
I certainly can't think of one. And there's only one that I can think of in my personal life. This may sound a little dramatic, but when I was driving into the refinery at 5 o'clock on the morning after the vote, the only other time that I could think of in my life that I'd felt like that was after the birth of my first child. I knew something exciting had happened. But I also knew that life would never be the same. So for us, I can understand why a lot of businesses see a lot of challenges. But for us, it's the single biggest opportunity we've ever had.
But it's interesting you say that, Gerald, because it's an opportunity, but it's still shrouded in a great deal of uncertainty, because you are still in the dark as to what it's going to look like, right? Have you been told that the British beet sugar business isn't going to say, we want all the rights that we've had in the EU, we want all the protection that we've had in the EU transposed over to Brexit Britain? And then you'll still be in the same position in a Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, we're really confident that the British government can now deliver on what it's always fought for in Europe, which is a sugar market that is fair and balanced between beet and cane. And you're absolutely right. This discussion isn't just going to be about us. It can't be any worse for us, at least, than it was in Europe. We've had to downsize the factory in London by half. Lots of good quality jobs.
Gavin?
It's a really good illustration of how Brexit can, even within a sector, within the same industry, it can produce different conclusions. Just as Gerald's business is suffering as a result of one set of measures, there are a whole bunch of other businesses that have developed their business model on the basis of those measures, and therefore if you pull the plug on one set of protections, then there's a whole load of other people who'd be very concerned if that were to be the case. And so this is what I think makes it such a complicated job. It's really, really important, as Gerald's done, to work out how are you really affected by Europe, and it's perfectly possible that a great many businesses will conclude that they're not really affected by Brexit at all.
Look, isn't the most interesting sort of intellectual challenge of all of this, and maybe business schools will be talking about it in 20 years' time, is this contradiction between trying to plan for something when you don't know what it is?
I think you have to get down to the nitty-gritty facts. Whilst you don't know exactly what's going to happen, you can say what's the worst case scenario, what's the best case, what's something in the middle, and therefore what would we do in those different scenarios. We've been looking at clients' business and fund flows and what do their competitors do, what happens in that market, really getting down to that nitty-gritty of what they actually do, and therefore also then saying what really are the deal breakers, what are the things you want to talk to government about, get involved in your trade bodies.
Now, you have a thing, though, Karen, 222. Why don't you explain that to us?
Oh, yeah. The 222 model. So what you do in the next 2 weeks, 2 months and 2 years. And the reason for that was really to say the first couple of weeks, you've got to get a bit of calm and stability. You've got to speak to your people, your customers, get a message out there, try and calm things down. You've got to look at your financing. And then you've got to start looking a bit more forensically, if you like. So what we did for KPMG was the immediate piece was talking to our clients, talking to our own staff. So we've got 900 EU nationals in KPMG in the UK out of 12,000 staff, and 20% of our workforce are international workers. So they really wanted to know what was going to happen to them. Whilst we can't say it's this or that.
You said we don't know.
We wanted to say we care about you. This is what we can help you with around residency, whether you can get a passport, what your options are, and really to put that calming message out there. And a number of our clients have done a similar thing as well. And then you've got to start looking a bit more forensically, if you like, examining what your business does and what are the bigger impacts. And then the longer term will be, what do you want to do around your business model and your operating model? We
would probably call that short-term, medium-term and long-term. But 222 is so much better, so much better. How do you approach this, Gavin?
We've got something not dissimilar, but we call it analyse, assess and address.
What is it? Analyse?
So analyse, assess and address. Analyse what your exposure is to Brexit. Assess what the impact is. How important is it to your business? And then address it. So decide what you're going to do with it. Are you going to lobby governments, get them to preserve your situation in their negotiations with the EU and the rest of the world? And then what's your fallback? What's your risk mitigation?
I'm heartened to listen to Gavin and Karen because by accident rather than by design, it sounds like we've done the right thing.
Excellent.
It's not just our raw sugarcane supply that's the issue for us. Brexit will have lots of other impacts. We buy about 5,000 different things, bits of stuff to keep the refinery working, bolts and nuts and energy and paper bags for the sugar, all these sort of things. And for the first time a few weeks ago, we sat down and looked at where we buy those things from, and about a third of them are from the European Union countries outside of the UK. And you get a bit, that's a very large spreadsheet, and you have to start saying, well, which are the 10 that you spend the most on, and which 10 are the most sort of business critical to keeping your factory going? And What we found is that if you can start breaking the problem down into something that's more digestible, you actually can start to have some sensible thought process.
Does it sort of provoke you to say, well, actually, let's have a look. Is there something more competitive? Would you actually think about getting it from a different supplier?
If it costs us more to buy some of these inputs from Europe, we might either choose to buy more from UK suppliers or look to the rest of the world.
You're not expecting that you won't be able to buy the things that you currently, the supplies you buy from the EU and to carry
I mean, we'll always be able to buy them. The question is, will that still be a competitive supplier, I guess? You know, the paper that the sugar comes in, we buy paper from Italy, from Poland, from the Czech Republic, from Scandinavia, as well as from the UK. And so the first question you ask yourself is paper going to be in a single market or not? And if it's not, will there be an import tariff? And then the second thing you say is, well, this isn't just the flow of goods anymore that arrives on your lorry at the factory gate at the time you want. You've got to actually import it. That requires, obviously, a process.
a customs process.
A customs process.
Yeah.
You might need to hold more stock. There might be some cost to that customs process. So it is, I mean, intellectually, it's quite fascinating. I'm a little bit nervous about running a business through it all, but it is quite an interesting process.
One of the things that economists have talked quite a lot about as this period of uncertainty is the notion that investment suddenly gets put on hold because people will not want to be investing in big kits, new factories, new plant, because the uncertainty just means you're not quite sure you're in the right place with that investment. Have you got much experience of whether that's happening?
We've been seeing a whole mix. If somebody's in the middle of a deal, retail store or something like that, they might start to think, well, hang on a minute, do we really want a headquarters in Europe, as well as having a headquarter in London, so that at least we can have the optionality? But then if they're already running a business and they don't have a decision point, they tend to be a bit more wait and see.
We've had the sort of immediate turmoil. Then now we're in the kind of lull. Is it going to be a lull before the storm? We're not sure. Will there be more uncertainty to come once the negotiations begin? Will that have further effects on confidence and sentiment? Will the pound slip more? Will there be a mild recession? All of those things still, I think, open to question. And then what are the eventual effects of whatever new arrangements are put in place? What that creates is a very uncertain backdrop. And if you're thinking of where you put your next engine plant, if you're an automotive manufacturer, where you're putting your pharma research centre, then these are big decisions which involve large numbers in terms of capital expenditure, but they're very susceptible to the regulatory environment. And so whether you're in banking or pharmaceuticals or high-end industrials, those are sectors which are going to have people stopping and thinking before they commit.
What about the reverse? So I want to make sure I've got an escape route if it looks bad, so I better start thinking about putting an office somewhere in the residual EU. Now, actually, have you done a little bit of that yourself, Gavin?
No, certainly for the time being, we haven't taken any decisions to open new offices or close existing offices, nor would I expect us to. No. What we have done in respect of some of our lawyers is made sure that they're admitted in Ireland as well as in the UK, which means that
in Republic of Ireland.
In the Republic of Ireland, that's right. Because in certain parts of our business, it's important to be able to continue to appear in front of European courts.
In our case, I'm not sure it means you're going to invest less. Eventually, it will probably mean that we invest more in innovation. Yeah, but in the interim, there is uncertainty, and when there's uncertainty, you'll tend to invest in things that are more certain than less certain. So what I mean is that we have sugar factories in other countries in the EU, and we don't produce every single type of sugar in every single factory. And when it comes to investing in a new machine to pack or make sugar in our refinery in London, what we've really got to think about now is, if we're going to be making product there to ship to the EU, is that the right place to put it? And likewise, the products that we bring from our refinery in Portugal and Italy into the UK, should we be putting machinery in our London factory to make that? What's the way in which we can pay the lowest tariff?
You don't know the answers to these questions. So what are you doing in terms of investment now? Are you just waiting, biding your time, basically?
No. So instead of buying a machine that can only pack 3 different types of paper bag, you look for a machine that can pack 20, so that you're not locked into a certain product that you've got to pay a tariff on.
Before the referendum, there was a little reference to Brexit clauses, to contracts having a sort of break or an exit clause. Has there been much of that?
I'm seeing quite a bit, especially in relation to individual employees. So concern where there's a 4-year training contract. Will a company be able to honour that if after 2 years, the person has to leave the UK.
So it would say in the event of the law changing so that you can't remain in the UK, then the contract will be null and void.
At the moment, it's queries around what should we do, because we're concerned. And if we put something in a contract, are we discriminating against those people?
We saw relatively little in the way of exit clauses in the event of Brexit. But what we did see was a lot of people just holding off, not signing. Now, of course, we are where we are, and I think it's more a question of people pricing in the risk. And I'm talking about commercial contracts now, not employment contracts.
I think on employment contracts, we've found quite early on that some international workers who we'd made offers to decided they didn't want to come and join and come and live in the
Seriously?
UK, that they would either stay in their home country
Europeans?
No, international workers concerned that if they come and take a job in the UK, they won't be able to move around the EU. So either they stay in their home country, Australia maybe, or they find another country in the EU. And the same with some of our clients as well, senior management thinking about, do they base themselves in UK? What do they do about the European operations?
You know, your question about Brexit contracts, I mean, we haven't seen any of that, but I think the point is that will come. You know, we might sell sugar for 6 months, a year, or up to 2 years. Those are the length of the contracts, and we might buy raw materials and products from our factories for anywhere between sort of 6 months, a year, or 18 months ahead. And what we're just beginning to think about now is when we start looking at buying things like packaging materials, when that contract starts to tip over into that point, past 2019, that forward contract to buy it at some point in the future, how do we deal with that?
Well, look, let me just ask this, because as I'm listening to the kind of complexity over arrangements for sugar, which is about subsidies for beet producers, tariffs on cane imports, tariffs on sugar exports from Brexit UK into the EU. Karen, when are you going to be out of a job called head of Brexit at KPMG? It's not going to be done in 2 years.
There's a huge amount of complexity across all different sectors and different businesses. I would have thought it's going to be 2 or 3 years, and then it's implementing whatever we come up with. It's probably a 5 to 10 year play. I'll be retired by then.
A good bit of the debate is about how similar do we stay to the EU and how much do we diverge from it. Gerald makes a good point around sugar, and that's a very important part of the economy. But it's obviously one part of the economy, and everybody has their own agenda and priorities to pursue. I think it's a real challenge for government, assembling all those concerns, putting them in order, deciding which ones to prioritise and which ones to compromise. And so back to your original question about timing, that's what's going to take the time.
There doesn't need to be the same answer for every sector. I think this is what's going to be really interesting. There isn't one macro option where everybody has a 2-year or a 3-year or 4-year transition. You know, the beauty of what we've done is that Britain now has a choice. If there are good regulations that the EU have created that we want to adapt or transition out of over a period of time, we can. If there's bad ones the UK doesn't like, we can stop it from day one. I agree it's going to be a sort of fairly complex process where it sets all those different times.
So suppose Britain said, day one, we're changing our sugar regime to a more favourable one for cane. Wouldn't the first thing the EU say, well, I'm sorry, you can't sell your sugar into the EU?
I mean, that's exactly what would happen. But we're very cognizant of that. You know, you work through these scenarios and you realise that. And from our perspective, do I care about losing access to a sugar market that treats me so unfairly anyway?
How much of your cane sugar is exported into the residual EU?
We export probably about 20,000 tonnes a year now, so less than 5% of what we produce.
So you could live without it.
Yeah, but every sector will be different.
We're a professional services business. We're a people business. We employ a couple of thousand people in London and Belfast. But we also have offices on continental Europe, in Spain, France, Germany and so on. And our ability to be able to move people between our offices is really important to us. So in that sense, the aspects of the single market which allow free movement for our business are really important.
But hang on, you can't take a London lawyer and shove them in Frankfurt because the German law is different to London law.
No, that's right, but there are a great many German clients who conclude international agreements under English law, for example, who will want to see an English lawyer on the ground to take advice.
I think the reality is something's got to give, hasn't it? Because the people voted for, they didn't like the laws, they don't like immigration, they don't like the funding. So something's got to give around the single market and the free movement of people. A number of sectors, they're going to have to start doing things now. So banks are already looking at, do they actually make sure that they've got a dual centre within Europe? because otherwise to set one up at a later date is going to take some time. So do they start doing it now?
There are options that involve you being out of the EU, but only just out. And there are other models that involve being quite a long way out. People are characterising these, I should say, as hard Brexit and soft Brexit, or clean Brexit, and being in the European Economic Area. The Tate and Lyle view, Gerald?
We locked ourselves in a room at the refinery for a few days. I thought it was going to be a few hours to start with, looking at all these different models, and we had to have a second whiteboard put on the wall because we filled up the first one, and we didn't think there were 3 or 4 or 5 options. I think we got to about 16. At the end of all of it, I said to the guys, look, what is it that we really want? We want to be able to buy cane sugar from suppliers that we choose, and we want to buy it without paying the 100% tariff. And really what that means is you answer your own question. If you're going to do that, you're not in the single market.
You're not in the single market. You're also not going to be in the customs union. Now, they're two slightly different things. Turkey's in the customs union, but it's not in the single market. If there's a customs post between Britain and the EU, then everything that is exported from here to there goes through the customs rigmarole. With a form filled in 3 times, and an inspector has to check that the goods match what's on the form. That's quite a big ask for the rest of the economy, though, isn't it?
I think the conclusion that I got to was you end up in a scenario where none of these models really work. You have to have a bespoke deal. If you look at the bilateral free trade agreements that EU negotiates today, every sector and every product within every sector is treated differently in every deal between the two partners.
I mean, the bit that gives me a headache is thinking about supply chains, because one of the things that the single market was designed to encourage was to have integrated European supply chains. So you might make one bit of the car in Germany, export that bit to Oxfordshire, where it's going to go into the finished Mini or whatever. Can you imagine a situation in which those parts, if you like, between integrated operations are going to go through customs procedures? Or will big international companies say, no, we're not going to have the UK in a European supply chain?
You've either got to change your supply chain in those scenarios, which isn't easy because you've got to look at where you're getting your product from and how's it bouncing around different states. Or you're going to have to say, let's have a lighter touch customs process. So it might have to go through a border, but let's have something that isn't over-engineered process, so it's very light touch. And I think that's something to think about.
I think you border on something very interesting there, which is something called the rules of origin. For your listeners, they will have never heard of this before. But
we might have heard them actually in our pre-referendum Brexit programme, where we did get the rules of origin. But for those who may not have heard at that time.
So the rules of origin are a set of rules that determine where a product actually comes from. And of course, that's very easy for something like, I don't know, a pint of milk that comes out of a cow in the UK, but it may not be so easy for a product that's had lots of different things brought together from different countries and combined in one place. I don't think it's likely that sugar will be in the single market, but if it were, the sugar that we produce in our sugar refinery in East London wouldn't qualify to be British, and so we couldn't export it to the EU, even if we were in the single market, because the European Union says that if you bring in cane sugar and refine it in a big factory like ours, that sugar doesn't change origin. So if we bring it in from Jamaica, say, it's still Jamaican sugar when it comes out the other end of our factory. So that whole question of complicated supply chains is really important, not just how's that going to work if there are borders, but actually what is the product called at the end of it when you build it? Is it British or is it something completely different?
All right, well, look, how do you think the government's handling it, and how much lobbying is going on? You Gerald, must be doing a lot of lobbying.
Well, you know, we're raring to go. You know, we could go to the government tomorrow with a 37-page document on what the sugar regulations should look like. But of course, life's not that simple. A bit like Karen's 222, I think, you know, what we're planning to do in the first stage is to give a very simple message, which is the first thing you've got to do is take us out of the customs union. And I think that's the sort of level of debate there is at the moment with the government. We can talk about the detail of what happens next later.
I mean, government's pledged to talk to and listen to business, and I think that's really critical. So I think we all have an obligation to stand up and speak for our industries and our businesses and get involved in the trade bodies and get our views known, because if you don't do that, some of the idiosyncrasies and complexities won't be known. And a lot of work's been done by a number of businesses already.
I'd agree with that. I think government is listening. It's an enormous amount of information to take in and then to prioritise and to decide where are you going to compromise. This isn't going to be business as usual. But making the decision about which areas of the economy you're going to compromise is the devil's own work. And the real challenge is maintaining some semblance of stability in the meantime, because the real risk is in not having a clear path, not having a clear timescale, and at that point investment and confidence and sentiment really suffers, and people, international investors, will take their money elsewhere and people will vote with their feet.
Gavin, Karen, you both have international clients, don't you? I mean, non-British clients. What are they saying when you talk to them?
One American client of ours wrote to us the morning after the vote, and he said, I saw the news, courageous, bold move. We did it 240 years ago. It was quite scary to begin with, but it gets better over time. So I think most clients were surprised. The comments were made to me last week in India to the effect that we always thought you were a bunch of sort of stable, sober lot. The overwhelming view, though, is there was a great thing that had been created in Europe that, in their eyes, had assured a degree of peace and stability and free trade. And most people were a little incredulous at us seeming to turn our back on it.
Some see it as an opportunity to do deals, cheaper to do deals in the UK.
Cheaper because of the exchange rate?
Yes. I think also it starts to open up some of the trade corridors between different countries, and there's an opportunity there for businesses in Asia as well as the US to invest in the UK. So a real mix of delight and disappointment, I suppose.
And Gerald, I'm going to give you the last word.
In the days after the Brexit vote, we had cane sugar suppliers from all around the world knocking on our door saying, is it tomorrow? Is it next week? No, take a few years, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
All right, well, let's leave it there. What a fascinating, multi-dimensional topic Brexit is. Maybe come back to you all in a few years and we'll see how it all turned out. But let me thank my guests. Karen Briggs, Head of Brexit at KPMG. Gerald Mason, Senior Vice President at Tate & Lyle Sugars. And Gavin Williams, a partner at the law firm Herbert Smith Freehills. Do visit our website, bbc.co.uk/bottomline. You probably need to listen to it about 3 or 4 times to get every intricacy. Otherwise, I'll be back with more guests next week.